The next presenter is Professor Bruce Allworth. He's at the Fred Morey Centre of School of Animal Health and Veterinary Sciences at CSU at Wagga Wagga. Bruce is also a producer and he's pretty much the go-to. He's an expert in many different things, but today he's going to be speaking on the best practice vaccination and managing 3 key animal health issues. And welcome, Bruce, if you can hear us.
Yes, I can. And hopefully you can hear me. And hello to everyone there. I can't actually see you. I'm sorry to stop Wayne talking. I think I could listen to Wayne all day. So, but we'll have a bit of a change here, and we're going to talk, as we said, about mostly about vaccination. So, can you hear me okay there? Okay. Righty, I've got my way. So I'll give you the key messages in case any of you are getting hungry and you drift off by the time we get to the end of this. Vaccines are generally a cheap and effective means to prevent disease. I'm sure you already know that. Efficacy depends on the challenge, and everyone wants to know how effective a vaccine is. And you'll see around COVID vaccination, that was all the topic. How effective is the vaccine? Well, vaccine efficacy actually changes depending on the challenge. And vaccines perform better under lower challenge. So anything you can do to reduce the challenge also makes the vaccine more effective. And that's worthwhile remembering. Most vaccines require 2 doses initially, and it's sort of a bit second nature now to talk about vaccination with everything we've had with COVID. But the COVID vaccinations were absolutely spot on what they were trying to achieve. And then, although they weren't annual boosters, with animals, we're mostly using annual boosters. The other thing that I often neglect to mention with vaccines, but is very important, is that they must be handled correctly. There's a reason that they have to be stored in the fridge, most of them, and that is because they have a very short shelf life out of the fridge, and giving a vaccine that's had the proteins destroyed won't cause the right reaction. So you need to administer them properly and handle the vaccines properly. And you need to assess what diseases your stock are at risk to and make sure that they're vaccinated prior to the risk if there's a vaccine available. So that's all pretty basic, but I'll just run you through a couple of things with vaccine, and apologies if it is basic, but I think if we start with the basic stuff, then when we get onto the more complex things, you'll be happy with that. So just in terms of how vaccines work, what we're doing is we're giving an antigen, and we're usually getting an antibody response to that vaccine. There is one exception to that, but we usually give we're looking for the antibody response, and that antibody is protective. And what antibodies do is they basically rush around and mop up the virus or the toxin before it can take effect in the body. So having a certain level of antibodies in your system is an important way of preventing disease. Initially, the response is slow and low. But the second time you get hit with an antigen, the response is always much quicker and much greater. Now, what happens in a natural disease process is often an animal is faced with the challenge on multiple occasions. So they end up getting a higher immunity than you'd expect from, in inverted commas, a one-off challenge. But in terms of vaccination, when we give an antigen just as a one-off vaccination, that gives us an immediate response, which takes 10 to 14 days to occur and then lasts around about 3 to 4 weeks, and then it drops off. But when we give that second vaccination, we get a much higher response, and it will last for a lot longer. And that's what we're after with our vaccination. The timing of the second booster dose is what's on the label is what the minimum requirements are. But just as something that's important if you're giving advice to producers is, if you don't give that second vaccination within the prescribed time on the label, That doesn't mean the second vaccination won't be effective. It just means that between the period when you were meant to give the second vaccination and when you actually give it, the animals have no protection at all. So if, for example, you give a vaccination, you wait 4 to 6 months before you give the second vaccine, almost certainly that second vaccine will still give a second vaccine response, a high, long, quite quick response. So it's really important to at least get a first vaccine in and not be too concerned if you can't get the next vaccine in according to the label. But if you want animals covered for the maximum period of time, then you do need to follow the label directions. So I think that's one of the really important things that I often get questions on. In terms of immunity, the immunity wanes over time if there's no natural exposure. But just remember that if there is natural exposure occurring while animals are vaccinated, that will act as a vaccine in itself and further boost the immunity. Whether or not we need to be giving annual boosters does depend on that level of challenge. And most of the work around annual boosters is in very naive environments where animals only get exposed to a specific antigen at a particular time. So it's possible that we get even longer duration than we see. And this is why some people say, I only gave 2 vaccines and I've never seen a problem since. In some cases, 2 vaccines is highly effective. For example, tetanus, it's likely to last much longer. But equally, things like in sheep, pulpy kidney, probably don't last that 12 months, almost certainly. In fact, our best information is pulpy kidney vaccine probably only lasts for 3 to 6 months. And if you're concerned about pulpy kidney or you're putting lambs onto things such as lucerne paddocks, you might want to give another vaccination before they go onto it. And I'm going to talk specifically about pink eye shortly. And so when you give the vaccine, depends on when you consider the risk is and what the level of natural exposure is. And I should have said that all of this information, the reason I'm giving this presentation is MLA asked me to write more recent vaccine updates, and they're on the MLA website. If you look under livestock advisor updates for vaccination, you'll see one specific to sheep and one specific to cattle. Just a bit more on handling and using vaccine. More is not better, and that's always the case with vaccines. So it's important they're kept cold, but freezing will kill vaccines. When I say kill, it'll denature the proteins and make them ineffective. So vaccines need to be stored in a fridge that is an effective fridge and doesn't start freezing things. And if somebody rings up and says, my fridge went haywire and it froze them, is the vaccine all right to use? The answer is no. In terms of medical people, it's a requirement that they actually have a thermometer measuring the temperature every minute of the day that the vaccines are in. So the COVID vaccines that you receive, somebody could tell you the exact temperature that those vaccines were held in the whole time. Equally, when I was in Nepal looking at foot and mouth disease, they couldn't use vaccines in Nepal simply because they couldn't maintain cold chain storage because they only had power up to 16 hours a day. They didn't have power 24 hours a day, and that was in their capital city, Kathmandu. So it was impossible for them to actually, one, make their own vaccine, and 2, even use the vaccines at that point. Equally, sunlight is just as a problem, and heat obviously is a problem, which is why we keep them cool. So if you're if you're going to drop some vaccine into somebody, or somebody's coming pick some vaccine up, make sure it's in an esky. Wintertime, not much of a problem. Summertime, where we all work, it's a major issue. So make sure they're looked after properly. Make sure you read the label. If you're distributing or using vaccines, so that you know how to give it. Most vaccines, and I think there's 2 exceptions to this, are subcutaneous. And obviously you need to watch hygiene and use eskies where appropriate. I've been asked to mention economics of vaccination. And look, how long is a piece of string? Every scenario is slightly different. But essentially, vaccination is very, very cheap if there is a risk of animals getting a disease. The only time vaccination is a waste of money is where you can guarantee there's not going to be challenge to the thing you're vaccinating for, in which case you're wasting your time. But in almost all cases, vaccination's highly cost effective where somebody considers they may have that risk. So what it comes down to is it comes down to assessing the risk of how likely a disease is to occur. Now, if you've got prime lambs and they're worth, $180 to $230, and you're trying to grow them very quickly, you can almost guarantee they're at risk to 2 or 3 clostridial diseases, and the 38 cents or whatever you've got to use for a clostridial vaccination to give an extra boost to vaccination is absolutely minuscule. Equally with the price of cattle, if you've got a $2,000 weaner, you bring him into the yards just before you're going to sell them, one bumps on the edge of a gate as they come in and dies from blackleg. Having the cattle adequately vaccinated is well worthwhile. And I noticed the price of bulls in the last couple of weeks seems to be going up and up again. Bulls should really be vaccinated very regularly because they do fight and they are at risk to clostridial diseases. So I guess that's really the point we want to make on the economics. And in the fact sheets, there are some points about the relative merit of vaccination. I will give one example in a minute. So there is a formal way of doing it. If you said that a disease was going to occur 1 year in 5, and the cost of the vaccine was a certain amount, and the animals are worth a certain amount, then it's fairly simple to work out what's going on. So, for example, if a clostridial disease was only likely to occur 1 year in 5, and when it did, it killed 5% of the animals, then the cost of that is going to be $750. And so the annual cost of vaccinating those animals then becomes $150. Sorry, that's $1,500. What's going on here? Vaccination for 100 animals will keep those animals for 5 years. Sorry, I absolutely mucked that up. I'll start that last bit again. At 32 cents a dose for 100 animals, you've got a net cost of $40 a year versus an average cost of $150 a year. So you're well and truly in front. And when you come and look at the cattle, those differences are much bigger. Just in terms of, there's in both of the fact sheets, I've got tables for cattle and sheep. For the sheep ones, we've got the clostridial vaccinations, which are the 5-in-1, 6-in-1, which has got cheesy gland in it, 8-in-1, which has got the extra pulpy kidney doses in it. And we've also got 3-in-1 as well with the cheesy gland in it. I probably won't say anything about clostridial diseases. You're all very aware of them. Scabby mouth is a scratch vaccine. It's a live vaccine. It's also something people can get, so we call that zoonotic. And so you have to be a little bit careful, and you also have to make sure you don't get disinfectant where you're applying the vaccine or you will actually kill the vaccine. It won't be effective. Ovine Johne's disease, I should just comment on the Guedere vaccine. The Guedere vaccine is very dangerous if it's self-injected, and you really should be using a safety vaccinator. And that's another exception to our 2 doses. It's a single dose. It works mostly on cell-mediated immune response rather than antibody response. So we can get away with a single dose for life for sheep with it. You may or may not have been talking with clients about Campylobacter abortion, but where there's a risk with Campylobacter abortion, given that the high cost of lambs, it's become much more topical. There is a vaccine that is pretty effective in terms of preventing abortions or early embryonic loss from Campylobacter. And I will mostly recommend to people that at least think about doing their maiden sheep, either their lambs if they're joining at 7 months of age, or their hoggets if they're joining at 19 months of age. The thing about Campylobacter is you're probably getting a fair bit of natural immunity. So the older sheep in a flock are generally not nearly as prone as the maidens. Similarly, with erysipelas or arthritis vaccine, that's quite difficult because there are a number of causes of arthritis. But if you have got an arthritis problem, the erysipelas vaccine is useful. I'm not going to talk about the foot rot vaccines, but I'm happy to answer any questions on those. I'm not sure how relevant that will be to everyone. So in terms of the sheep program, we generally look at lamb marking, giving a 6-in-1 scabby mouth, plus or minus Guedere if you're in a Johne's area, and plus or minus an erysipelas. And then you've got your booster with a weaning dose at 6-in-1. You don't need the weaning dose with either scabby mouth or Guedere, and usually the risk with erysipelas is past at that point. The pre and post joining is when you give Campylobacter. The second dose must be given immediately post joining if you haven't given it pre-joining. And the other important time is pre-lambing with the 6-in-1. And if you're concerned about arthritis, then that's when you give erysipelas vaccine as well. I must just say that to get ewes in southern Australia into wet, muddy yards on the point of lambing and late winter lambing, just to give them a vaccine can be very counterproductive. And you will get very high levels of immunity in those ewes and in their milk to cover the lambs for 3 to 4 weeks by giving that vaccine a lot earlier than we normally say. So where it says on the packet that it should be ideally given 2 to 6 weeks before lambing, my experience is that you will get a very good response if you give that at a bit earlier time, and you'll decrease your risk of getting foot abscess and subsequent preg tox from yarding those ewes in wet, muddy yards. If you don't have an issue with wet, muddy yards, then giving that pre-lambing vaccination on the point of lambing is fine, but it really is asking for a problem if you've got to bring late pregnant ewes into wet, muddy yards. And rams should be given once every 12 months, but given the value of rams at the moment, I'd be doing them every 6 months. There are trace elements in a lot of the vaccines these days. Whether or not you need them is highly debatable. Most people don't need B12, but that's the most common one in there. But just be aware, particularly with selenium, vaccines are given on an animal basis, not on a body weight basis. Vaccines are given on an animal basis, not on a body weight basis. So a 90 kilogram ram gets 1 mil of 6-in-1, and a 10 kilogram lamb gets 1 mil of 6-in-1. It is due to the antigen load. It is the only thing we give that is not related to body weight. Yet trace elements should be administered in terms of body weight. So suggesting that you're administering trace elements with vaccine is only appropriate in young lambs. It's not appropriate in older animals. So if you're needing to get trace elements into older animals, you need to look at other alternatives other than the vaccine. And the other thing is that you need to know the history of purchased sheep if you're going to continue on with a vaccine program. If you don't know the history, you have to assume they haven't been vaccinated. So similarly with the cattle, I guess the big differences with the cattle are having lepto in the 7-in-1, which is probably more for safety operator issues rather than productivity issues. We still don't think we get a lot of abortions associated with leptospirosis in beef cattle, but there is a risk of contracting lepto yourself over calving in unvaccinated herds. I'm going to talk specifically about pink eye. There's a Pestigard vaccine for BVD, and that's really around knowing what your BVD status is and what your risk is as to whether you should be using that. There's a calf scours vaccine. Again, it doesn't necessarily cover all the things that calves will get scours from, but when used, if you've got a problem, it generally is seen to be reasonably effective. We've got the bovine respiratory disease, either the MH or the MH plus IBR ones, particularly relevant if you're selling cattle into the feedlot industry. We don't tend to see much BRD, we don't tend to see much BRD in pasture-fed animals. Vibriosis is a very simple way of avoiding Campylobacter in cattle by dosing bulls. And I know it's a hassle to dose bulls, but they really should be getting a Vibrio Vax every year, at least 4 to 6 weeks before joining. For those up north, we won't talk about that now. There is a femoral fever. Those in the there's a botulism vaccine and there's a Johne's one. I'm happy to answer questions on those, but I won't mention those ones just for time. So with our cattle program, we're looking at 5-in-1 or 7-in-1 plus pink eye at calf marking, depending on the risk with pink eye, and I will talk about that. And we've got our post-marking or weaning booster. Again, a lot of people won't get the animals back in to do the second vaccine 4 to 6 weeks later. In the sheep program, that sort of happens automatically between marking and weaning. In cattle, there's often markings done at a young age of sort of 3 to 8 weeks, but weaning mightn't be for 3 or 4 months later. And it's just a matter of assessing the risk. Certainly from pre-joining, if you're worried about BVD, that's heifers must be vaccinated prior to joining. Otherwise, you're going to run the risk of decreasing your heifers in calf, and you need to have the lepto booster in place if it's going to have any effect. And pre-calving, again, to make sure that the calves have got some immunity, is whether you're using 5-in-1 or 7-in-1 and the calf scours. And I've mentioned with bulls, Vibrio certainly every 12 months and Clostridials probably every 6 months, and BRD for the steers going into feedlotting. Some feedlots offer a premium if you have vaccinated them, which I'm sure you're aware of. I've got a bit of a lag as I'm using this. So I just, that's what I want to sort of cover on vaccine. I'd probably much rather have questions on a vaccine, what you all want to know. I'm just going to now touch on 3 issues around vaccine, well, 2 around vaccine and 1 quasi around vaccine, that I think are very topical at the moment, and I've been having a lot of queries about these ones, so I'll just mention those. So the first one is one that I haven't mentioned, and it's probably not so relevant in the audience that we're talking to here, but there is, and there has been now for several years, a vaccine available for Barber's Pole, and it's quite different to the other vaccines that we use. And I think the most relevant thing for us in Southern Australia is we do get Barber's Pole occasionally, but we're probably going to deal with it with an oral drench, not with a vaccine. But just to understand how much effort has gone in and how still difficult it has been to develop a vaccine against one individual worm, and getting a vaccine for all our worms, which we'd all love, is still a challenge. We're working on it, not myself personally, but the veterinary profession is working on, the scientific community is working on getting a broader spectrum vaccine. But if you understand a little bit about Barbavax, you'll know how difficult it is. So this is specifically just for the Barbus polar or Monchus worm. And initially, to get the system going, you don't just need 2 doses, you need 3 doses. So that's 3 to 4 weeks apart. And you probably need to give a drench at the same time as those doses to knock out the worms that are already there. Once you've then got the animal primed without worms in them, then it looks as though the Barbavax is quite effective, provided that you give doses every 42 days. So it's quite labour intensive, but certainly in the New England, where it's a constant threat over the summertime, they'd be drenching every 3 to 4 weeks normally. So doing a vaccine every 6 weeks is actually less, and it's clearly not adding to the pressure of the on the drench. So it's likely to prolong the drench. And so there's a couple of scenarios here. One is with the hoggets that haven't been previously vaccinated, and then if they come through as they've been vaccinated as lambs and they come through, then they don't require quite as much vaccination. But you'll see in each case that they're given a drench. So it's a combined strategy. And as I've mentioned, and it's a really glib thing to say, but vaccines work best when there's least amount of challenge. And so anything that you can do to minimise that challenge through pasture management will actually make the vaccine program even more effective. I think we've got to try and get away from just relying on single products or single actions to deal with a lot of our diseases. And I'm sure you're all across that. That's come in a different spot. So we'll come on to, I just want to talk about pink eye. I'm not sure about you, but in our neck of the woods, this last year has been one of the worst years for pink eye. And as a result, I've had a lot of questions about pink eye and whether people should be vaccinating or not. So I just want to reinforce how pink eye occurs. Pink eye only occurs when you get some sort of damage or irritation to the eye, and then the organism that is present frequently in normal eyes can then set up an infection. And so you need some sort of initial damage, and that can either be with dust or with long grass. So you've got 2 scenarios there. Your very dry seasons, when you're getting a lot of dust around, dry summer periods, and you're getting the sorts of big springs that we had last year and probably the year before, but last year in particular, in our neck of the woods with long grass such as Phalaris, really knocks around particularly the young animals. And causes some damage to the eyes, which then can set up the pink eye infection. Flies are definitely a risk factor. Their role, we're not actually 100% sure whether they're spreading the organism or whether they're adding to the irritation, but they're certainly, or both, but they're certainly a part of the factor, and controlling flies will help with the spread of pink eye. And the other interesting thing that I have not really taken enough amount of notice of, but just UV light. And I mean, if we could make sunglasses for our cattle, wraparound sunglasses would always also be better. We'd probably solve the pink eye problem. And the way that they make pink eye occur in research is they just expose the eyes to UV light for a certain period of time, and then they apply the organism and every animal gets pink eye. So it does reinforce the importance of UV light. So provision of shade, but what can we do about UV light? You know, that's one of the things, but I'm just pointing that one out. So the organism is Moraxellus bovis, and that's the one that caused it. There are 3 other organisms that are all involved in pink eye, and we get them. We can recover them quite easily from these eyes. The IBR virus is one, Mycoplasma is another, and the other one that you may or may not have heard about is Moraxella boviculi. they both occur in healthy eyes. Baviculi looks like a pathogen, but it can't initiate a pink eye. So as a result, controlling it, which some people are suggesting we should be doing, won't actually make a difference to controlling pink eye. So it's really concentrating at this point on Moraxellus bovis. Understanding what role baviculi had would be very helpful, and we don't understand that yet, but it probably won't be a target for control of pink eye, as in the absence of Moraxellus bovis, pink eye won't occur. In terms of the vaccination, well, firstly, treatment. I've described treatment as being problematic. There are very good treatments for pink eye. So cloxacillin eye ointment, which is readily available, or parental antibiotics, such as long-acting Oxytet. They work well if you get them early in the individual animals. The difficulty is that to treat the animals, you're usually getting in the herd to isolate, to identify the animals that need treating. And by yarding the animals, you're putting them in close contact, and you're probably putting them in dusty yards at most of the time it occurs, and you're probably stimulating the spread of the disease. So you might actually make it worse. So that's why it's problematic. Adding corticosteroids or doing sexy things like subconjunctival injections it probably doesn't make any difference. There's some work that Michael Lawrence has done. He's now with MLA, but before he went to MLA, he was doing a lot of work on pink eye that suggests that even the levels of antibiotics that we're getting are insufficient, but we certainly do see some recovery rates. The role of patches is probably more cosmetic and stopping damage rather than actually making anything occurring. But probably the key thing is, what's the role of vaccine? And I've just taken a snapshot here out of the excellent technical manual that Coopers provide with it. But they do claim 80% efficacy. And as I've said, how long's a piece of string when you're talking about how effective a vaccine is? But most suggestions are that it's not very effective. And one of the queries I have is it's a single shot vaccine. It's a pill eye vaccine. It's actually identical to all the foot rot vaccines, and we've got a number of pill eye vaccine. Pill eye vaccines always require 2 shots. So giving a single shot will give you short-term immunity. And I'm guessing when the marketing came along that it was found that because the pink eye season is generally short, that by the time people giving a second shot, the pink eye season was already over. So they've just recommended 1 shot. It does only cover 3 of the 8 strains. And our experience with working with pill eye in bacteria is that's the thing that they can change very quickly. And there is, Michael Lawrence has done a study. I did ask him if I could put up his data, but he said, no, I couldn't at this point. It still hasn't been accepted at MLA. But they looked at 6 herds with a lot of animals in them, and 6 out of those 6 herds, vaccine had no efficacy. And the rates of pink eye in the control animals was around the 20% in all those herds. So it was a decent test of the vaccine. Having said that, I still use the vaccine in my cattle because pink eye is a very annoying problem, and anything that can help, maybe it does help in some circumstances. And certainly Coopers were able to find one trial where it did work, but you'll note that trial is unpublished, so we can't review that trial. The real issue around vaccination is it often appears effective. And the reason it appears so effective is probably threefold, but people often respond to a bad year of pink eye by saying, next year I'll definitely vaccinate. And probably the animals have already got a high level of immunity, and giving the vaccine on top of that, whether or not they would have got the disease is questionable anyway, but you probably are getting a much higher level of immunity. The other thing is that the existing strains might take a couple of years to then change to a strain that's not covered to the vaccine. So what I'm expecting most people to see with the vaccine is a variable response. Some people will say the vaccines work really well, and some people will say the vaccine hasn't worked at all. What do we do? How do we interpret all of this? I guess that's just up to people understanding that it's a really frustrating thing to deal with. We have a vaccine that in some cases may be worthwhile, but don't hang your hat just on the vaccine. And I would suggest that the suggestion that it's 85% effective is an overstatement based on what we've the information we've got coming through. In my specific herd, despite everything I know, I probably had as much pink eye as anyone last year. These animals were vaccinated at calf marking in October, and by the time we got them in at weaning time in March, April, we had 63 out of 158 in one group that we scored with pink eye, despite that Pilligard vaccine. In hindsight, I probably should have got them in 4 weeks after I'd given the Pilligard vaccine and given a second one, even though that's not mentioned on the label. Yet previously, I'd given two doses of vaccine. I'd had less than 2 out of 350 cases, and I thought, gee, I'm a smart person. I know what I'm doing. So it just shows that you think everything's going well. You've got a good program, and then with pink eye, the vaccine probably isn't as good as we think it is. The final thing I'm going to touch on is bloat, only that we've been asked a lot about bloat recently, and I've given a couple of webinars on it. It is a real problem. We want our animals growing quickly. We're putting super on our pastures if we can afford to get the legumes going to grow the grasses. And bloat occurs on high legume pastures, which are also the ones that we get high growth rates on, which is clover dominant and lucerne based pastures. The most effective prevention is a probiotic, in which we can read the word antibiotic, and that's how most of the world will interpret that. And unfortunately, at the moment, the capsules with that probiotic in it, Manensin, aren't currently on the market. And it's really a really depressing issue for producers, because they go out every day wondering whether there's going to be another dead animal. So why am I talking about that in a vaccination talk? Ironically, vaccination does not help with bloat, but if you're getting clostridial disease and it's not bloat and clostridial diseases occur under the same conditions, then vaccination would have been effective. And people have often said, oh, if you vaccinate with 5-in-1, you'll stop bloat. Well, no, you won't stop bloat, but you will stop them dying from clostridial disease. So the very first thing is make sure you get your diagnosis right. And the three most common things of sudden death in animals will be nitrite poisoning on these sort of pastures, bloat, and plus or minus enterotoxemia, although most producers are pretty well vaccinated these days. But the one thing the vaccine doesn't last very long for is enterotoxemia. So how can we prevent bloat? Well, I mean, the issue around bloat and why it's still an issue is there's plenty of prevention measures out there. None of them are 100% effective. So you can put out bloat blocks, but does every animal have it? You can put out licks, Manensin or Terric oil. You can put them out as licks. You can add in hay in the system. And I've got a calculation there to indicate you need to have around about 10 to 20% of the diet with as hay to make any difference. The longer term, we might capsules may come onto the market. There's trials going on at the moment to get them back on the market, but whether they do or not, we'll just have to wait and see. And changing our pasture mixes may be a longer term solution, but the reason we've got the current pasture mixes is because they are so good. So I've got there's a few things. Dairy farmers have a lot more options. Water dispensers work really well, but you've got to keep on topping them up every day. You've got to have a reticulated system, no access to water other than in the reticulated system, or again, they're not as effective. And you can do things like pasture spraying if you strip grazing. So you will hear that. if you're talking with a mixed group of producers, beef and dairy farm, the dairy farmers will say, oh, that's pretty easy to solve, whereas the beef farmers will usually have a problem. The answer to every problem is always select against it. We've obviously been selecting against bloat for years, and it doesn't seem to have made a lot of difference. I think a lot of bull producers grow their bulls very well under conditions where they die for bloat. And in fact, a lot of people who ring me are bull producers with bloat issues. So animals don't get through that are at risk to bloat, they die. And we've still seen the problem. We've got plant factors and we've got weather factors, and just sorting out what those different factors are is still some of the work that needs to be finalised. So I guess I haven't got anything that you guys don't already know with about bloat. I hope you all are aware of the Bloat Alert app, which is available. It's downloadable free both on your iPhone and on Android devices now. It doesn't stop bloat, but what it does is it's an early alert system, so that if a producer in a district has bloat and records it on app, every other producer who's downloaded the app gets warned that there's bloat around. And what tends to happen, as you'd be fully aware, is that bloat occurs on a district basis when seasonal conditions are favouring particular growth patterns of clovers and lucerne, and so that's been quite useful. We've just had 5 alerts in the Riverina, southern New South Wales area in the last week. We haven't had any prior to that, so we're just starting to see a little bit of bloat here. So, I mean, if you're dealing with a group of producers, it'd be worthwhile making sure they use the bloat app. It was developed by my son in conjunction with myself and Cara Wilson, but we don't get any royalties or anything out of it. It's purely just out there for everyone to use. So I just alert you to that. And I think that is then time for questions, and we're almost up to time. I'm sorry about that. I should have allowed more time for questions.
Hi, Bruce. Penny Schulz here. I'm one of those bull producers that started crying when the bloat capsules disappeared off the market, and,
Yeah.
and there was a couple of friends of mine that did buy up everything that was left. You mentioned the reasons why that went off the market, and I heard some other rumours. Do you know what the actual reason was why they disappeared?
Yeah, absolutely. The two things happened with the capsules. They were shown that they didn't release under certain circumstances on lucerne pastures. And when those animals then went into feedlots, they then released all of them in incident once. So they had animals dying with the capsules in them on lucerne, and then they had animals that were fit and well going into feedlots that then died from an ensign toxicity. So those two things resulted in them having to take it off the market in 2013. The same capsules are still on the market and used in New Zealand. And the work that's going on at the moment is to try and make sure that the dispensing of the monensin is consistent under different pasture conditions.
Hey Bruce, Elsa here. I just had a
Hi,
quick
Elsa.
question. Hello, lovely to see you. You can't see you, but you're in big picture at the front of the room. I had a question about bringing rams from MN3 properties onto properties where there's been a long history of Giddere vaccination in the ewe flock. So you're essentially bringing an animal from a test negative property onto a property where you potentially have Johne's disease cycling, albeit at a low level. What's your thoughts around whether we should be doing anything with those rams?
Yeah, I would be vaccinating those rams. I don't think that's much of an issue. We're not talking large numbers. That's quite easy. I think it's a much more difficult question if you ask me about bringing a mob of sheep on, and then it's a matter of how long they're going to survive on there. Yep. It generally takes from adult sheep, if they get exposed to Johne's, they even take longer than lambs to start shedding the disease. and showing up the signs. So you're looking at about 3 years, and often people are trading sheep that are a bit older. But if you're buying highly valuable animals that are going onto a place that haven't previously had an exposure, they can't ever be counted under rules. The rules are that to be counted as an accredited vaccinate, that it has to be done between 4 and 16 weeks. But the assumption always is that that's on an infected place. So if you're very confident that the animals coming in are negative to yonis and haven't previously been exposed, then it makes sense to vaccinate them and keep them protected. Is that where you were heading with that?
Yeah, my second question, you've sort of addressed it, which was if you're buying in, if you have producers buying in ewes from those same properties, from MN3 properties onto vaccinating properties, what's your strategy?
Look, I guess if they're buying in hoggets, I'd be vaccinating them. But if they're buying in 4 or 5 year old ewes, I definitely wouldn't be vaccinating them, because those ewes, even if they pick up Yoni's organisms the day they get on the property, won't be shedding them or showing any signs for another 2 to 4 years probably.
Yep.
And so they're going to be back out of the system. So I wouldn't be concerned.
Yep, thanks. My second question was if you had any comment about the difference between bovine pink eye and ovine pink eye, just for...
Yeah, lots of comments, and I can't go there at this stage only because we don't have a vaccine for ovine pink eye, and it's a mycoplasma. So there are differences, and the bovine vaccine won't have any efficacy in the ovine situation. But you've opened a can of worms there, so I'm not going to go there, Elsa, which I think you probably know.
G'day, Bruce. Rob Inglis here.
G'day, Rob.
How you going? Bruce,
Good.
we're getting quite a bit of feedback from processors about there's still too many people using half-inch needles, particularly in lambs, causing carcass damage. Is that something that you're seeing, witnessing?
Yeah. It's quarter-inch needles are shocking to use, Rob, unless you use a safety vaccinator, and then they're great. So, I think the answer is we all should be using safety vaccinators. It's much more effective to do it. You haven't got your hand right near the site when you're putting it in, and it is something that we all should be aware of. And I think, to the credit of the vaccine companies, they're strongly pushing and only provide quarter-inch needles in the packs. Good point.
G'day, Bruce. Sam here. I was just wondering around products, iophenols and products like Bovatec and their relationship there with antibiotics and programs that are antibiotics free.
Yeah.
Is there any comments around that in terms of, especially with the uprising containment feeding and lamb finishing systems?
Well, it's only what you already know, and I think we all know is that in the end it's going to be consumer driven, and it's perception as much as fact. But the perception will be that any of those will be classed in the role of antibiotics, and given the issues around antibiotic resistance in people, that's going to be a very hard one to go against. Look, to me, it's the same as growth promotants. There's plenty of science behind their use. Some people still use them, but basically they have very low adoption rates compared with what the production benefits would suggest.
Thank you.
I don't think I answered the question. I just made a comment, so my apologies, but there is no real answer to it.
Any more questions?
I'd love to chat on. I'm really sorry I'm going to have to go. The reason I can't be with you is that I'm hearing a lot of student presentations today, and they start again at 1 o'clock.
Yeah.
And they're even worse than us if I run late, so I better head off.
Thanks very much, Bruce, for your time.
Good on you.
Thank you.
Okay.